Now, just as there was this contextual prudence with John Wesley, I want to suggest more briefly that we see this in the North American setting as well. This leads me to the next main point on the handout. The contextual dynamics of transitions of early Methodism in North America. John Wesley sends over the abridged or edited Book of Common Prayer. He sends over ordination. He helps with what makes possible the creation of the new church, the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784. They ordain all these lay preachers, none of whom had been ordained before. None had remained in North America that were ordained that Wesley had sent earlier. And he sends them out and says, be the church. And by and large, what they do is they say, look, what we know how to do is be a good society. These folk had not been doing sacraments before. They knew how to do the society things well. It's striking to me that you continue to use the word society instead of church in the minutes for another 20 years. It will take them over 20 years to actually change the minutes and start sticking the word church in. And what I think is it shows their mentality. What they knew how to do well were those aspects of church that had to do with communal formation and mission. And they were very good at this. Earliest American Methodism, I suggest here, was more a society or as church than it was fully church. They still functioned as society. One of the ways we know this is they required you, on a given day in any local congregation here, if you had 100 in attendance, how many would you assume that congregation probably had in membership? 200, 300, 400? In earliest Methodism, if you had 100 in attendance, the likelihood was that you had only 20 that were members. Maybe 30, maybe 40. Attendance was much higher in membership because to be a member you had to go to class meetings. They still had all the rules of the society. And you had a lot of folk who were interested but weren't yet ready to make that deep commitment. It was a society and it had those strengths. It had deep strengths of working as a connectional, formative fellowship with evangelistic outreach. The clergy were primarily in this, the connectional leadership. Remember, they're riding the circuit, preaching. It may take them 3 months to get all the way around the circuit. Then they have the quarterly meeting. They ride it again. Who's doing the ministry in local settings? It's almost entirely in the hands of lay servant leaders. The class leaders, the visitors of the sick. They're doing the marrying, they're doing the burying, they're doing the formation, they're doing the discipling, they're doing a lot of the preaching. The traveling preacher is only there on occasion, though it's an important connection. And probably in earliest Methodism, when they're most the church, I agree with Russ Ritchie here, when they're most the church is when they're gathered at quarterly meeting. From those various outposts gathered together to celebrate, to recharge, and to go back into mission. But the mission is carried primarily by the lay servant leaders in that setting. But over time, what happens is we watch it move from being a society that's calling itself church to becoming more and more church. And then the question is, where's the role of society? One of the ways that this is striking is when the circuit riders dismount, when being assigned as a circuit ceases to mean riding, or when itinerancy ceases to mean riding the circuit, and means instead you're going to be 1 year here, and then you're going to be 1 year here, later it's 2 years here and 2 years here. But when you get off the horse and settle, some very significant things change. That is, once you're settled, you're there every Sunday as the clergy person. And what you do as work has changed significantly. It's no longer, I just preach and get them organized and get them rallied and then say goodbye and head off to the next. I've got to feed them week by week. One of the things that came out of this immediately was a change in educational expectations. Peter Cartwright even mentions one time that most early preachers only had 2 or 3 sermons. So they didn't need much education because you'd use them, you'd ride the circuit about 3 times, then you'd move them. So that they wouldn't hear the same sermons over and over. But now if they're going to stay and preach for the whole year, you need a much broader range of sermons, you need more education, etc. And what we watch happen as the clergy settle is we watch them take on more and more of the leadership in the church, and interestingly, the laity don't just say, okay, you're here, you do ministry, we'll sit back and take. What they do in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they say, we'll move out and take on ministry in the world. So they create the volunteer societies going out in world missions and Sunday school movement and all of these forms of ministry in the world. The clergy are helping form them in the church to go out and be in service in the world. But what that leads to is a need for significant change in ministry education, and we watch it happening. The expectations climb for what ministry, for those doing ordained ministry, what education they should have. And it's traced very well in a book that GBHEM will be publishing later this year by Russ Ritchie. So I'm not going to go through it all, but I just remind you of this, of one, what I see as quite intriguing and crucial event. And that is up until 1956, from the earliest years to 1956, if you watch the books of discipline, the standard way into becoming an elder was course of study. And then they said, now, you can substitute for course of study, if you've had it, a college degree in religion that used all the books of course of study. Or you can substitute for course of study a seminary degree. In 1956, we reversed that. We made the MDiv the requirement, the standard for entry into being an elder, and now course of study became a substitute that was allowed in certain circumstances. And by 1960, over 85% of those that were entering elders' orders had a seminary degree. Now, I teach at a seminary. I mean, I'm not going to criticize that. It pays my salary, I suppose, but this had both strengths and weaknesses about it. The strengths, it provided for a much broader range of training. It enabled us to live up to some of Wesley's expectations that clergy be able to read Scripture in its original languages and preach out of that richness, do the kind of formation. I mean, there's a lot that comes that's very good with that. But there's also some aspects of it that, while they fit the time, have come to have, I think, challenges for the present. Let me give you just, this growing professionalization, it seemed to me, fit very well the setting in the 1950s when the average Methodist church was a church of 150 to 200, if it was members, in a small town that could afford to pay for a full-time elder, and they didn't have all the costs of health insurance and all this kind of thing. Economically, it could work. We had the systems in place to make it work, and it worked fine. But those times have been a-changing. And do we perhaps, because what we did is we did away, only in 1956 then, with the structural possibility of local elders, of persons who could be ordained an elder without the seminary degree and not have to take on itinerancy, but could serve churches that might not be able to afford someone who had a seminary degree. What I want you to see is that decision was made not only for theological reasons. It wasn't just because they thought this is important to have a ministry where there are those who are servant leaders. It was made for prudential reasons about what we can afford, how many we have, etc. And it was made then. What about more recently? And what about the tasks that confront you? Well, in reviewing the ministry studies that I mentioned that have been going on for the past 50 years, I looked over them and I want to just highlight for you real quickly some of the reflections that come out of these studies as I read them with an eye to what are their deepest appreciations for what's gone on since 1950, since 1956, since we made this move to saying there's one model for what it means to be at least ordained servant leaders in the church, and that's a model of a MDiv degree, full-time commitment to itinerancy. What's happened since then? point, Trends in Changing Understanding and Practices of Ordained Ministry, 1950 to 2012, I title it. When you look over those studies, 4 things I would highlight. First, Methodists have taken leadership in affirming, and I then put in parentheses, in reclaiming women in ordained ministry. Since we started ordaining women in 1956, the same year we started requiring the MDiv, we moved to ordain women. I want to stress that's a reclaiming, because one of the things that's very significant about the way Methodists went about that is in real continuity with Wesley, is what we did not say is that we know Scripture's against it and tradition's against it, but we think we're more enlightened. What we said instead is, as we've continued to notice how God is gifting women for ministry, it's driven us back to the Scriptures, and we looked at them more deeply. And whereas what Wesley saw is that they only had the gifts to preach, we begin to see that in Scriptures themselves and in the earliest church, women were engaged in the full forms of ministry. We weren't changing tradition, we were reclaiming the earliest tradition. And frankly, it was only as we became convinced of that we could hold together Scripture and tradition and the experience of the Spirit, that we built the growing consensus for this move. And it's to the degree that we've helped our churches and those in our churches to become convinced of this, I think that they've embraced and welcomed. And we still have some work to do on that front. But Methodists have taken leadership in that. We've been at the forefront. Methodists have been at the forefront of the movement to reclaim ministry of all Christians. We added a section on ministry of all Christians in 1976 to the Book of Discipline, moved it to the front of the section on ministry in 2000. And yet it's interesting to watch the study commissions after that. The minute we say all Christians are ministers, then we've come back and say, hold it. But we still got to talk about the importance of having those who take on leadership in this role. It's still important to have some who will serve full-time or who will take on leadership. And what do we call that? Do we call that representative leadership or servant leadership? We've struggled to find the way to talk about how you connect leadership to the ministry of the whole church and who all ought to be set aside for doing that. And that leads me to the 4th point. The one that's consumed much of our more recent discussion is United Methodists have pioneered, we've been at the forefront on this, affirming deacons as a permanent, distinct, ordained order. We're not the first to have deacons, but to make it a permanent, distinct, ordained order, not just a temporary or a transitional order to elder. We're at the forefront on that. So we've been involved in and continue to ask, how do we think about, how do we, if necessary, revise our understandings of ministry and who's in ministry, even in these most recent decades, following in the long tradition of what Methodists have done. And yet we've also had concerns. Are there places where maybe we're stretching a little too far? A prudential contextualization asks you to stay in that conversation. What is it that we're being pushed to do by various things, and how do we do this in a continuing honoring of the broader church and of tradition and Scripture? And so this leads me to a set of ecumenical reflections, or another way to say that, when I went through the reports and watched, what have been the deepest worries? Where is it that we as Methodists in the last 20 years have been saying, at these areas where we're pushing the boundaries or working, are we going too far? Do we need to listen to our brothers and sisters from other Christian communities? How ought we to do this? The ecumenical reflections. United Methodists have played a prominent role in ecumenical convergence in ministries, been parts of dialogues and movements to mutually recognizing ministries with many of the other Protestant traditions. This has included a willingness to offer some of our distinctive commitments. In other words, we haven't said, in order to get together, let's back down on where we're different. We've continued to stand up for women in ministry and that kind of thing. But the point where we stand at greatest odds and have expressed the greatest discomfort in the last 2 ministry studies, if you look at them, with the broader church, is that in nearly a third of our local settings, non-ordained persons preside at sacraments. That's one of the key ones where we're living in that tension right now. What's the right way to do this that honors realities? And it is a tension because part of what creates that is precisely our deep, deep appreciation as Methodists for the importance of sacraments. A congregation needs to have access not only to good preaching and discipling and pastoral care, it also needs access to God's grace as that is conveyed in and through table and baptism. How do we do that? What's the right way to honor that and to honor our current expectation that the only ones who can be permanently ordained to do that are those who have finished an MDiv and gone through the processes. Once we've done away with local elders as a ordained position specifically for that, we have local pastors. I distinguish that from local elders, ordained in that as a permanent role. This situation that we have as much as a third of our congregations in which non-ordained persons preside at sacraments reflects not only our passion for the sacraments, but it reflects as well the increased educational standards for ordination and the elimination of the formal category of local elders in 1968. In other words, it reflects prudential decisions we made along the way. It's not the way we've always done it. It reflects decisions we made at a time when we thought the best thing to do to help ministry be more professional was to move to requiring this degree of everyone who's going to be an elder. At that time, we could do it. In a time of such high educational costs, such high health costs, etc., can we still? Or should we be continuing to think about that? And if we look broadly ecumenically, one last point, and then I'll turn it to a couple suggestions and your discussion. If we look to our closest Pan-Methodist colleagues, the AME, the AMEZ, the CME, and others, they all have ordained local elders. Is our model one we ought to be encouraging them to move to, or might they have something we ought to listen to in these ongoing reflections? And then missional reflections. The United Methodist Church faces an increasing diversity of mission settings in the United States and beyond. When we adopted the requirement for ordination, almost all of our churches were in rural settings or in smaller cities, and the ones in larger cities, only a few of them were really big churches. And what we were training was folks that would go to serve primarily as pastors of these. And at the time, most of those parishes could afford to pay enough salary, and they didn't have health insurance and that kind of thing to pay, that they could afford a ordained elder who had a seminary degree. But in the changing situation in rural settings, in the changing cultural settings, the broadening economic gap, the growing cities, and in some of the cultural settings. In many of these settings, it is no longer economically or culturally prudent to rely on or require leadership in ministry that carries the expenses involved in master's level education. It's at least a suggestion I want to make to you. And I came hard to this. I mean, I'm a strong defender of training as much as you can for ministry. But one of my colleagues, Edgardo Colonna Maric, leads our Hispanic initiative. And we set up and said, let's help train those in our region for ministry in Hispanic churches. And we've been able to get a few that had college degrees and could come and could do the MDiv and could find the financing, and we could help them find the financing to go back and serve. But it's been such a small trickle, by and large, because there's just not enough that are in a cultural and economic setting that they can have already the college degree that's required to come and do the MDiv. If we want to be able to provide ministry now in those congregations, we've learned we had to do a broader range of models, and we've been broadening to do that. Now, that's not to say one model is the right model for everybody. It's to say, I want to say perhaps instead, how do we build a little bit more flexibility into the system? Because our mission remains the same. Our mission remains to offer the full ministry of the church, to spread holiness, as Wesley put it, or to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, as we have put it in the United Methodist Book of Discipline, to do this as broadly as we can. Not just in those mega churches that can afford MDiv-trained clergy, but in the small rural settings of the Dakotas where you have to put together 3 or 4 at least to get it by, or maybe we need to be thinking of larger parish settings with a presiding elder that has the MDiv and then local elders to meet ministry in effective ways in those settings. At least it seems to me that among the possibilities when we're talking about excellence in ministry, going on to perfection in ministry, is to ask the question, how are we not only having those ministers who are the most excellently trained, because we need those, but how are we having ministry prepared for and empowered that can address the full range of the need of the churches that we serve? I'm not the one that can answer all those questions. It seems to me, though, that's the question that's on the table before you. And I see out there many who bring much greater wisdom than I do to answering it, or at least seeking the way to move forward prudentially. Because one of the things we can learn from our history is you don't come up with a final answer for all times. You ask, what's the right balance of the concerns for the present? I'm glad to know that you have responded to the call to come to this meeting and the call of God to be leaders in ministry in the United Methodist Church. And I wish you the best in these days ahead as you reflect on that.